Good afternoon. The Dudley Herschbach Teacher Scientist Lecture honors our own Dudley, sort of inspiring teacher and scientist to those of us at Harvard and across the country. And we're delighted that Dudley joins us for this event every year together with Georgine. And thank you for the inspiration that you've provided to us and that led to this lecture. Let me thank Dean J. Harris, Dean for Undergraduate Education, and his office floating around here someplace for sponsoring this lecture every year. Usually, we invite someone from outside the university who has distinguished themselves both as a scientist and as an educator. And as you'll hear in a moment, this year is an exception because we've chosen one of our own to be the Dudley Herschbach lecturer. And I want to welcome our friends at the National Academy of Sciences who, this worked out very nicely. They were holding their regional meeting today at Harvard over at the faculty club, and we were able to coordinate. And so Ralph Cicerone, president, is here, and Sue Wessler, the Home Secretary, is here, and other members of the Academy who are at the meeting are here in attendance at this lecture. So I'm going to turn the podium over now to our own Rob Liu. No one is more appropriate to be introducing our speaker today than Rob Liu, one of our most gifted teachers and leaders in education, now head of HarvardX at Harvard, head of our own Bach Center for Teaching and Learning, and I actually teach with this guy, and it's humbling because he's such a gifted communicator and inspire students so well. So Rob,
So one thing we spend a lot of time, I think, Rich, myself, and Dan Kahn from chemistry, telling our freshmen about in one of our freshman courses is the degree to which the reactions that drive life, while they may be favorable, they may be thermodynamically favorable, are kinetically very slow. And if you think about science education and what we've done with our students, or to our students, for all of these decades, one might argue that despite remarkably favorable conditions, where we have, I think, largely clear aspirations as to the end state, we know where they're starting from, it should be a favorable reaction, but somehow as the decades have rolled by, they've been remarkably slow. It's been striking that as scientists, we focused very much on evidence, but somehow, largely still, even today, many of us that teach do not apply that same lens of rigor, that same need for evidence to drive what we do and how we plan things to how we teach. That's someone that will look at a colleague's article in Science and say, oh, that just does not work. That is just not really a valid conclusion to draw from that, will nevertheless show up week after week in their class, stand up and do the same thing over and over again, and when asked why, will say, because I know it's the right thing to do, right? So that is one of those striking paradoxes that I think has characterized the teaching of science for a very, very long time. That being said, as Dan Kahn is sometimes fond of saying, that if we had to wait for the favorable reaction of peptide bond hydrolysis for us to digest our ham sandwich, we'd all be dead, given the hundreds of years that it might take. What we need is a catalyst. We need that critical force, that critical compound, and in the case of science education, those critical individuals that get the rest of us over the hump, that get the rest of us to finally realize that the reaction is favorable and to actually do it. And so Eric Mazur is without question one of the most effective catalysts in science education that anyone can think of. So Eric Mazur is the Balkanski Professor of Physics and Applied Physics here at Harvard, and he's also the Area Dean for Applied Physics. He's an internationally recognized scientist and researcher, and he leads a vigorous research program and has for many years in optical physics. He has been recognized for his work with awards from the Optical Society of America, the American Physical Society, and many other organizations that have truly recognized his work in terms of his research in physics. Eric obtained a PhD in experimental physics at the University of Leiden before coming to Harvard in 1982. In 1984, he joined the faculty and received tenure a scant 6 years later. The world recognizes him in research for his important contributions to spectroscopy, light scattering, nanophotonics, and other very critical issues in optical physics. But we're here today to truly benefit from and recognize the breakthroughs that Eric has done in science education, but also expressions of his deep interest in science policy, outreach, and the public perception of science. So he is a true paradigm of a scientist that is more than just what he or she does in the lab, what he or she publishes for their peers. This is a scientist that cares deeply about the communication of science, how the public views it, and ultimately what the future of science might be in this country and in the world. Thus, it's unsurprising that he devotes a significant chunk of his research group's effort to education research that seeks to verify ways to improve science education. And indeed, in 1990, he is well known in science education for the efforts he did in developing what we now know as peer instruction, or sort of affectionately known as clickers, which truly transformed what happens in the lecture, but indeed was just the beginning of Eric's thinking when it comes to the transformation of what we do with our students from something that is more passive to something that is truly active and interactive, most importantly. So in Eric, we have an individual that I think is one of those striking beacons of how a scientist can be both a leading researcher in his or her field, but also an absolute vanguard leader when it comes to science education. We often talk about what does it mean to be a scientist in the world? What does it mean to make a difference? What does it mean to engage science and share science in ways that go beyond our journals, our graduate students, and the students that are doing research in our respective labs? And I think without question, Eric Mazur is one of the greatest examples I can think of what it means to engage science and make a difference in the world. So I am truly honored to welcome to the stage a catalyst for change, both in science, the communication of science, and the education of science broadly. Eric Mazur.
Thank you. That was humble. Thank you. I'm deeply humbled to be received this way, to be standing in front of you. And I thought I'd start by telling you a little anecdote of something that happened to me about a year ago. I was boarding a flight to Buenos Aires and in New York to give a lecture. And I sat down in my seat, and next to me sat a young woman. We started talking. And it turned out that she had just obtained her degree from the University of Chicago. And she was working for a cloud-based education company. Now, I just started my own cloud-based education company, so I thought, I better find out what it is that she does. It turns out her company was making flashcards, these cards that have questions on one side and answers on the other, for smartphones. I had trouble not rolling my eyes. Now, it was about a month after the Hilt Symposium here on campus. And for those of you who went to that Hilt Symposium, a psychologist from University of Washington in St. Louis, Ruddy Rödinger, gave a fascinating talk about flashcards and about studying with flashcards. He had done tests in which he had looked at the retention of Swahili words after students have one study session with flashcards. And he showed in an article that appeared in Science in 2010 that if you test students 1 week later, they only remember 35%. After 2 weeks, you can't even measure it anymore. So I thought, she ought to know this. Now, it turned out I downloaded this paper. It was on my iPad, so I bent over, grabbed my iPad, quickly pulled up the paper, which incidentally also has suggestions about how to improve retention and memory. And I gave her the iPad with the abstract on the screen. She looked at it for no more than 10 seconds and then handed the iPad back to me. And she looked me straight in the eyes. And she said, "But we only guarantee that they will pass the test." I had never thought about it that way. But it brought back a vivid memory. My daughter, was a student here. She graduated a few years ago, pre-med. And she would come home with me during the weekends, and on Monday morning, we'd drive back to campus. I'd be sitting in the driver's seat, she'd be sitting in the passenger seat. Flashcards. "Natalie, what are you doing with flashcards?" "I have to learn all these amino acids." I said, "I have an app for that." "Seriously, I do." "It's a great app." She says, "Yes, but we're not allowed to use the iPhone during our exams." So that made me realize that students, even with the best intentions, because my daughter and I spoke frequently about learning and about teaching and doing well in school, that even with the best of intentions, students' study habits are driven by the assessment. And if memorization is indeed all that matters, we should have paid attention to this person here, Guido Sarducci. You may remember him. Some 43 years ago, right at the beginning of Saturday Night Live, he made a proposal for the 5-minute university. I don't know if you've ever seen this clip. If you have not, and I don't think many of you will have, Google it tonight and watch it. The idea is this. It's very simple, but it's brilliant. Just teach in 5 minutes what the average college graduate remembers 5 years after leaving college. For example, Spanish. All you need to answer is this. The question is, ¿Cómo está usted? And the answer, muy bien. Because, believe me, 5 years after graduating from college, that's all the students will remember from their Spanish course. Anyway, it's a hilarious clip. I urge you to watch it. Now, those of you who have followed my career know that for 20 years I've been bashing the lecture as an outmoded approach to teaching that focuses mostly on information transfer. By the way, that is a picture of me teaching my pre-med course right here. No, it's actually B, but it's in this building right here, next door. It's a very old picture. It was taken BC, before computers, using the overhead projector. Well, today I'm going to argue that our approach to assessment, and including the one that I've been using until a few years ago, is equally focused on the regurgitation of memorized information and cookbook procedures. And therefore, instead of developing 21st century skills, assessment is really mostly focused on ranking and classifying. So here's what I'd like to do in the next half hour or so. I would like to first focus a little bit on the purposes of assessment. Why are we assessing? Then I'd like to discuss some problems I have personally identified, and it's really only the tip of the iceberg. And finally, I'd like to offer a few concrete ideas for improvement. So let's start with a little bit of interactivity here. What I'd like you to do, and you can do this in groups, is see how many different purposes of assessment you can think of. Why are we doing assessment? So you may want to take a little piece of paper or something to write on, talk to the people around you, and then I'd like to hear some suggestions. But I'm going to give you a few minutes just to talk and reflect on what are the purposes of assessment. So please go ahead. So,
We're looking at formative and summative.
both, right? Let me turn this on. Oh. Well, I'm happy to see this animated discussion already. I would love to hear a few suggestions here, and I'm sure that many of you have come up with similar ideas. But first of all, how many of you have come up with more than 5 purposes of assessment? Oh yeah, quite a few. So assessment has not just one purpose, there's many of them. So let's hear a few suggestions. Just shout it out, I'll repeat it. Review the material. Elaborate on that a little bit.
You want to study for the exam so you do well, so...
Oh, make the students review the material. Okay, so I'll put that in the category motivating the students to study. Okay, anybody else?
And ranking people.
Ranking people, rating and ranking people. See if students are qualified, so maybe some kind of accountability. Okay, yes?
Helping students find out whether they understand things.
Giving feedback to the students to find out if they've learned well, all the way in the back.
Giving feedback to us as teachers to find out how well
giving feedback to the teacher to find out how well. Are there students in the audience here? I'd love to hear how students perceive the assessment. So, is there a student who's willing to speak up? Yeah. It depends greatly on the teacher professor. So give me some examples without giving names. Okay, very good. Anybody, any other students in the audience? Yes?
I think after I take a test, I can always tell, like, oh, this is how well I'm doing in class. I retain this much. And so, like, for a language, the grammar is here, but the vocab is here. This is the question that I got wrong.
Again, feedback to the students. I was actually giving a talk on assessment, precursor of this one, at the Nueva School in California about a week ago, and there were a few students, and they were all mentioning only things that have to do with reflection on the learning. I was really surprised, but then I heard later that they have no grades in that school. They've eliminated the grades completely. I was very impressed, very impressed. Here's what I sort of put together, and it pretty much mirrors what we've heard here. One is to rate the students, absolutely, and in terms of their peers. To rate the professor and the course, absolutely, and in the eyes of the department. To motivate the students, we heard that clearly at least once here. To provide feedback on learning to the students, so they know where they need to put their effort in improving their learning. To provide feedback to the instructors on meeting the needs of both the students and the department. To provide instructional accountability. There could be, especially if you're teaching in a K-12 environment, all kinds of tests imposed from outside, from AP, SAT to state standards that are one form of assessment. And finally, to improve the teaching and the learning. Now, if you look at this list, you see that the verbs in there are already contradicting each other somewhat. One ranking, the other improving teaching and learning, motivating the students. Last time that I did this little exercise, somebody said to punish. And maybe that is sort of implicit in some of these statements here. So, with that idea in mind, and already having established that we have a difficult problem to solve here because there are conflicting purposes for assessment, let's talk a little about some of the problems associated with assessment. And I already made the case that a lot of assessment is aimed at grading knowledge, and much of it factual. But I want to make the statement today that even assessment that claims to test problem-solving skills, and I think a lot of us do, I certainly did for many years without realizing this, do not really do so. And let me explain why. Let's first ask ourselves, what is a problem? What is a real problem? If you have a real problem, you know the outcome you want to obtain. The outcome is known. What is not known is how to get there. You have an interview in San Francisco. You head out to Logan Airport to take the last flight out to the West Coast. Your flight is canceled. You got a problem. The desired outcome is known, being in San Francisco. The question is, how do you get there? Any real problem fits that pattern. You're the CEO of a company. You've made new product in a certain category. Your goal is to make that product successful. The question is not making the product the outcome. The question is, how do you get there? You're an investment banker managing a big fund. The desired outcome is known, more money. The question is, how? So I would say most real problems we face in life fit that pattern of a known outcome with an unknown path to that outcome. Now, most textbook problems are very different because they ask, especially in the sciences, because they ask students to apply known procedures to find unknown answers. Cars driving along the road, blah, 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 and so on. It hits a tree. What was the velocity of the car before it hit the tree? The student, in her mind, looks for a formula that gives velocity, then searches for the formula that has the appropriate unknowns, puts in the number, and gets the answer. Now, it may pay to briefly stop and think about the thinking skills, and I'd like to put up this little pyramid here, which is due to Benjamin Bloom, an American psychologist, who ordered these thinking skills from lower order at the bottom to higher order at the top. My claim is that a real problem tests all the way up to the top of this pyramid, whereas most inauthentic problems test at the bottom. Let me give you a little example. Years ago, I was painting my living room on a Saturday morning, and I ran out of paint. I hopped into my car and drove to Harvard Square to buy some paint. You may know this hotel, I forgot, its name keeps changing. It was the Harvard Motor Lodge. I don't know what it is now. It has this parking lot underneath with 20 spots on one side, 20 on the other side. Until that morning, I had the practice of pulling in on one side. If there was no space empty, you'd pull out back into front of the Charles and then back in again, and then turn around and go and go and go until somebody freed up a spot. That Saturday morning, for a reason that I don't know, I decided to stay put, give up on the other 20 spots. And as I turned off the engine and waited, I thought, how long am I going to have to wait? And I thought to myself, can I estimate how long I have to wait? And I thought about it for a few minutes and came up with the answer, 3 minutes. And looked at my watch, and sure enough, 3 minutes later, somebody came up and freed up a spot. I felt so good. Now imagine we turn this into an exam problem. On a Saturday afternoon, you pull into a parking lot with unmetered spaces near a shopping area. You circle around, but there are no empty spots. You decide to wait at one end of the lot where you can see and command about 20 spaces. How long do you have to wait before somebody frees up a space? I think your students will go to the dean to complain. Because what does it require to answer this question? It requires making assumptions. It requires developing a model. It requires then applying that model to come up with an answer. So if we look at this pyramid that I showed before, it really requires skills all the way from the bottom to the top of the pyramid. Which of the things, of the requirements that are on there, do the students hate the most? Making assumptions. Why? Because you lose solid ground under the feet. So given that assumptions are the most terrifying to students on an exam, and I don't blame them, I'll get back to why that is, even though, let's face it, the ability to make correct assumptions is probably one of the most useful skills, no matter what type of job our students are eventually going to take. And the reason we're terrified about it is because of the uncertainty and because of the fact that we never get to train those muscles that help us make assumptions. So let's make the assumption. Just add one sentence. On average, people shop for 2 hours. 2 minutes is too short, 2 days is too long, so 2 hours is probably the right ballpark figure. You've maybe nibbled a little bit at the top of the pyramid, but it still is a pretty difficult problem because it requires students to develop a model that they've not seen before. It would be unfair. You know, I can't resist to tell you a little other anecdote. I'm going to get carried away with anecdotes here. But a few years ago, I was giving a talk at a university south of here in Connecticut. I won't name any names. And in the physics department about teaching. And after my talk, one of the faculty members came to me and he said, I've had something really strange happen in my course this year. He wanted to put he taught physics to engineers, and he had wanted to put it into a real-world context. And in order to put it in a real-world context, he used baseball. I mean, there's a lot of physics in baseball, right? Trajectories of balls, collisions between balls and bats, runners running, you name it. So in class, he'd use examples from baseball. On the homework, he would put baseball problems. On the midterm examination, he'd put baseball problems. At the end of the year, he was preparing the final exam, and he realized he'd run out of baseball problems. So he put some football problems on the exam. Professor, complained the students, we have never done any football problems. You're laughing about it, but I think we should really be crying about it. Because, let's face it, unless you can transfer what you've learned in one context to another context, you have not really learned. Anyway, let's take this model that the students have never seen before out of the problem by putting it inside the statement. Assuming people leave at regularly spaced intervals, how long do you have to wait before somebody frees up a space? Well, still, if I were to put this on an exam, even in that shape, people would say, why is Professor Mazur putting these silly parking lot problems on the exam? So instead, I'm going to take this problem and I'm going to turn it into a standard textbook problem. Here we are. Oh, by the way, with that last, putting the model in the problem, we've dropped 3 notches actually to applying and no longer evaluating, analyzing, creating. Okay, so let me turn this into a standard textbook problem. Here we are. On a Saturday afternoon, you pull into a parking lot with unmetered spaces near a shopping area where people are known to shop, on average, for 2 hours. You circle around, but there are no empty spots. You decide to wait at one end of the lot where you can see and command about 20 spaces. How long do you have to wait before somebody frees up a space? You say, isn't that the problem we started with? Yes. But somewhere in the book, there's this formula, colloquially known as the parking lot formula. T wait equals T shop divided by N spaces. And the students have memorized that equation, and all they need is a calculator. And all of a sudden, we drop down to the lowest level, remembering. I've exaggerated perhaps a little bit, but I think if you critically evaluate many back-of-the-chapter textbook problems, they fall precisely in this last category. Now, the thing is, computers can do this. And just as assembly line jobs have been eliminated by robots, so do I predict that computers will eliminate any job that requires information retrieval or procedural problem solving, because it can be done by computers. And therefore, we should really focus on what I like to call real problem solving. We have a problem, however, because as I alluded to before, real problem solving is erratic by nature. It's not that you have a straight path from the problem to the solution. You may try out one approach, it doesn't work. You may try out another approach, it doesn't work. In fact, I would say the road to any creative solution, to any innovation, is littered by failures. And unfortunately, because of the way we educate, students have become afraid of making mistakes. In a sense, our grading is incompatible with real problem solving because it penalizes students for making mistakes. They become risk averse instead of being encouraged to take risk. So let's now turn to the environment. Let me pull up a picture and ask you what that picture represents. I'm sure you instantly recognize this. And if this picture evokes any pleasant feelings, then I would like to talk to you at the end of this talk. What kind of feeling does it evoke as you look at that picture? I'm asking you. Stress? I beg your pardon? Sympathy. Work. There's another word I'm looking for. Anxiety. Okay, so we've got the stress and the anxiety out. What else? Frustration. No? Isolation. Thank you very much. Look at these people. Cut off from each other. Cut off from any source of information. I'm sure you remember these moments, and they still apparently cause a lot of, bad feelings. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever, in your professional life, encountered a situation where you were cut off from any source of information and from other people? No. In real life, we work together. We can look up things whenever we want. There is nobody standing near my desk while I'm writing a paper on the research I do, saying, you're not allowed to look up the paper by your colleague at Yale. You should have known this by heart. It's not about remembering information. It's really about knowing how to use it. And of course, traditionally, assessment has been a high-stakes affair, culminating in the final exam. Students study for exams. Professors encourage students to study for exams. Now, unfortunately, high-stakes examinations promote cramming, and as we all know, cramming only stores information in short-term memory, and consequently, there's neither retention nor transfer. In a sense, examinations are the silent killer of educational innovation. I realized in that discussion on my flight to Buenos Aires that I'd overlooked assessment, and that no matter how innovative the approach to teaching, it's the assessment that drives students' behavior. Instead of studying for exams, they should really study for learning. And assessment should really be used as an opportunity to improve the learning. And in that respect, I think feedback, and we heard that as one of the purposes of assessment, is absolutely crucial. On the one hand, we have grades, which provide a measure of standing relative to others. On the other hand, assessment provides an opportunity for feedback, on reflection on what has been learned. I realized also that assessment produces a conflict. As teacher, I want to coach the students to be the best they can be. If I succeed in doing that, I want to give them all an A. But at the same time, I'm put in the position of being a judge. Imagine somebody who coaches, let's say, a figure skater, trains for the Olympics with the skater, and then all of a sudden at the Olympics is put in the position of judge. You'd have a serious conflict. In a sense, we face that conflict all the time in our classrooms. On the one hand, being the coach, on the other hand, being the judge. So how do we resolve that conflict? Well, we resolve that conflict by going to something like objectivity, by being fair and reliable. But here's a real problem. If we go back to this pyramid, you can only judge the lowest order thinking skills objectively. In other words, in the name of objectivity, we resort to measuring something that ends up not being very meaningful to the careers of our students. Anyway, there are more problems like grade inflation and cheating, and I can probably fill a whole talk by just doing that, but I want to end by making some concrete suggestions and present 4 ways that might improve our assessment techniques. The first one is, let's mimic real life. It took me a long while to realize that cutting off students from information actually sends the wrong signal to them, because they have to memorize the information, which they will not need to do for their final exams. I made a slow transition. And first I gave them a sheet of formulas, and then I said the next year, bring in your own sheet, only to discover that some developed this microscopic way of writing. The whole textbook is on 1 page. Incidentally, those pages provide quite an insight into how students organize the information. Anyway, then the next year I thought, why don't they, if they can write the whole book on 1 page, why don't they just bring the book? So I told them, bring the book. The next year, some student says, well, I prefer this book rather than the book that we use for the course. Can I bring that book? Sure, bring the book. And then another year, students said, oh, I'd like to bring my notes from the problem set. Can I bring those? Sure, why not bring them? In fact, you can bring anything you want except another living person. And a communication device. But then, and actually by doing that, I realized two things. One is you send a very strong message to students. It's not about retaining the information, it's about knowing how to use the information, which still requires the same knowledge as you would otherwise, but it frees you from memorizing it. But then I started assessing my students using the computer. And that posed another problem, because now all of a sudden students would be able to Google anything they want. And that's what made me realize that actually if you pose a question to which the answer can be Googled, it's not really an authentic assessment question. So I'm fine by that, because if we look again at this pyramid, what that does is it removes the bottom part of it. There is no remembering. There will still be remembering, because if you need to look up something fairly often, you remember it automatically. You remember it not because somebody made you remember it because you need to use that information. And in a sense, it lifts the entire exam. So rather than being easier, it becomes harder in the sense that it tests higher order thinking skills. So that's about cutting off information. I'm going to show you a little video clip from a class in Indonesia. It's in Bandung, Indonesia. And it's in Malay, so you won't be able to understand what they say. But I want you to look at the video and then tell me what activity the students are involved in and what the discipline is. So what's happening here?
Grading papers written by their fellows.
They grade papers written by their fellows, and they're having a lot of sadistic pleasure in doing that. I don't need to hear some more here.
Looking at exam solutions.
Looking at exam solutions. They are taking a quiz. They're doing an exam. They're actually taking an exam. Guess what field? Statistics. Have you ever seen people have this much fun in a statistics class? This whole exam centers around this little form, which is called an if-at form, instant feedback assessment technique. It comes from team-based learning. How many of you have heard about team-based learning? A few people. If you have never heard of team-based learning, look at teambasedlearning.org. It's really a fabulously interesting approach to teaching. But the assessment, called readiness assurance, involves a multiple choice exam. I know, it's just not the ideal, but bear with me for just a second. And the first time that I became aware of this, I was at the University of Delaware. I was Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar, and as Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar, you have a 3-day program, and they shuttle you between different departments, and you observe some classes, and you teach a class. And on my schedule was this biochemistry class. I went to the class. It was 10 minutes early, so there were no students yet. And the instructor it was a class not like this. It was 5 round tables, each was 8 chairs. And the instructor was putting pieces of paper on the table, and I introduced myself, and he said, today we have an exam. And I thought, oh, there must have been a scheduling mistake. So I thought, shall I do some email outside? He said, no, I want you to participate in the exam. And I said, what's the exam about? Hemoglobin. I said, I don't know anything about hemoglobin. Anyway, before I could protest, students had come in. I was sitting at one of the tables. I got a multiple choice exam and a little piece of paper to write my answers on, 1C, 2B, and so forth. For 20 minutes, it was silent, and I didn't think much of it. First of all, I couldn't answer the questions, and secondly, I'm not a big believer in multiple choice, and thirdly, why was I there? But then after 20 minutes, the professor picked up those little pieces of paper. That was 50% of the exam credit. And then put on the table one of these if-etch scratch cards, one per table. As you see, there are rows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and columns A, B, C, D. And at the correct answers have been pre-coded with a little star behind that paint that you scratch off like on a lottery card. So what happened was the students at my table said, as soon as they started, first they appointed a scratcher, and then they said, well, one was a pretty easy question. I got C. Did you also have C? Yeah, everybody had C? I'll scratch C. They scratch C. There's a star. They go, yes, we got the right answer. But then it became interesting. For two, there's a disagreement. Some had A, others had B. You cannot scratch off both for full credit, so you have to decide. So the A's were trying to convince the B's were trying to convince the A's, and all of a sudden, they started talking like scientists. And there were aha moments. Oh, yes, remember, the professor said this or that in class. Let's scratch B. They scratch no star. But you can scratch a second time for half credit. If it's still wrong, you can scratch a third time for 1/4 of the credit. So in row 2, they've uncovered 2, they get 2 points. In row 4, they've uncovered 3, you get 1 point. I was really excited because, you see, by the time the exam was over, the students walked away. They had gotten feedback on their learning. It was been fun. They had actually learned during the exam. They had gone, oh, yes, now I get it. And best of all, there was no grading. It's all done. This was many years ago, and I did not implement it because of my dislike of multiple choice. But in this past 2 years, we've implemented it on the computer. So students can now answer any type of questions, symbolic, graphical, text, you name it. So they sit at tables, and they first answer the questions individually, and then, this is from actually a math class, not my own class. Here it says, what is the derivative of function of x equals 3x squared minus 6x? Brian has entered 6x minus 6, Brent 6x, Bess 6x minus 6, and so on. So in the team round, rather than using a scratch card, the students get to see on their screen how all the other students have answered. Now they have to argue with each other, decide which is the right answer. Maybe none of them is right. And then answer gets graded instantly, and there's feedback. Let me show you a little clip from my own class. So the individual round is not very different from a standard examination. They're sitting there and, let's move it first, and looking at their screen, calculating, and entering the answer. So that's not very different. But then I press the button and we start the team round.
Is this one? Yeah. I would say B. It's across that's greater back. Oh my god, I love it. 11:13. Yeah. Who did this? I did. Oh, jeez. You wrote for 5. I said it in over DL, and she was like 3, 2, and
the magnetic field coming out of the board. And so that would be so it'd be thumb cross.
So, in fact, if you were to walk into my class during one of these assessments, you'd be really surprised if I told you it was an assessment. And you actually saw smiles on the faces of my student. So that's one. Secondly, I think we should focus on feedback, not ranking. After all, isn't objective ranking a complete myth? Can't we all think of many people who had stellar transcript and ended up not performing, and people who had no transcript or terrible transcripts and ended up being stellar? In fact, for this talk, I did something which I'd always wanted to do but never got to do. I decided to go back to data I'd obtained a long time ago and plot 2 metrics in the sense of evaluating students, then plot one versus the other. On the vertical is the final grade, which is based on the final exam. In that year, I was using a final exam, 2 midterms, and it was 80% of the grade. So, and the exams were purely textbook problems. That's on the vertical. On the horizontal is a very different metric, a 29-question test of students' understanding of the concept of force, tested purely by words. If you ask graduate students to solve, and faculty to solve the problem, they'll make 1 to 3 or 0 to 3 problems. According to the author of the test, and there's been a lot of research done on this test, anybody who scores 21 or lower is still an Aristotelian thinker, has really not understood the concept of force. But look at the distribution on the vertical. There are some students who ended up almost acing the test, and of course others who did very poorly, but there's a huge distribution. If we look at students who score at the highest level on the conceptual understanding, you still see a very broad distribution from a little over 60% to 100%. Let me draw your attention in particular to these 2 data points. Here's somebody on the left who is still an Aristotelian thinker, has not understood the meaning of Newton's laws, discussed in week 1, but got an A. And on the right is somebody who scored at a level you would expect of somebody who understands the physics, but got a C. Is this objectivity or is this injustice? So I think the idea of being able to rank people is a myth, and we should really focus our assessment much more on feedback than on ranking. Lastly, or no, not lastly, because I have one more, we should focus on skills, not content. A big influence in that respect was this book by Grant Wiggins called Understanding by Design. The traditional approach to the course planning is to start with course content. In this course, we're going to cover topic A, topic B, topic C, topic D. Then you start covering these topics, and after a while, you ask yourself, how am I going to assess it? In this case, the course is completely determined by the content. But rather than thinking about the input, we should really think about the output first. What are the desired outcomes? This is the way you would solve a problem in engineering or a problem in business. You want to start at the output end and ask, where do I want to go? What are my desired outcomes? And then, after formulating these outcomes, you ask yourself, how am I going to assess these outcomes? What am I going to accept as evidence that I've actually accomplished these? So assessment is built in from the beginning. And only then do you think about the instructional approach. So in that case, course is defined by the outcomes, by the skills, by what you want your students to be able to do at the end of the course. And the advantage of this approach is it builds assessment in from the beginning. The assessment informs the instructional approach. Lastly, we should resolve this coach-judge conflict because after all, we're here not principally to judge our students. We're here to help our students be the best they can be. I teach a project-based course. It's amazing what my students are doing on these projects. I want to give them all an A. In fact, I think they all deserve an A. So what do I do about that? Well, a colleague from MIT gave me the perfect idea. Use external evaluators. Assign a panel of other people. I can design the rubric, I give to them the rubric, and they are the evaluators. Ideally, a group of people respected by the students. Lastly, I think another thing that is important, and it was mentioned earlier on, to use peer and self-assessment, which is important, I think, for the development of metacognitive skills, the ability to judge your own learning. After all, nothing is worse than having people being ignorant and unaware of it or not knowing where they should put their effort. And in that respect, I can highly recommend an approach called calibrated peer review, which was developed at UCLA, which I've used a couple of years in some of my classes with great success. It's an unfortunate acronym, CPR, because if you Google that, you'll get all the wrong websites. But If you type in calibrated peer review, you will find the right website. You start with an assignment. It could be a writing assignment. I think most of it gets used for writing assignments, but it can also be used for other types of assignment. It was developed by in the biochemistry department at UCLA. So you develop a rubric to evaluate the assignment. So you have a writing prompt and a rubric. And then there are two other phases. One phase is for students to upload their work, a window for, let's say, a week. And then there's another phase called the review week. So students upload their pieces to the website. And then in the next phase, they are going through a calibration phase. They get to read 3 pieces that are uploaded by the instructor, one that is scoring high on the rubric, one that scores low, and one which is a medium scoring piece. Of course, the students are not told which is which. And the system compares the students' grading according to the rubric, because the rubric is pre-programmed in the system, to that of the instructor. So after grading those 3 pieces, the students get a calibration score. If they're lousy judges, they get a low calibration score. If they're really completely in agreement with the teacher, they get a high calibration score. Then they get 3 pieces of their peers anonymously. And this can be used in classes of hundreds of students, right? Because it's all automated. So they grade each of these pieces according to the rubric and provide a score for their peers anonymously because the names are removed from the work. Now, that score is weighted with the calibration, right? So if they're high, if they calibrate highly on a scale of 1 to 6, their score carries a lot more weight than that of somebody who is a very lousy scorer. And then, after seeing these 3 calibration pieces, which span a wide range, and 3 pieces of their peers, they get to review and grade their own piece. So not only do you see your own work in the context of that of others, you get to look back at what you've done, which in a normal class you don't do. You hand in your work, and then you wait 2 weeks, and eventually you get your grade back. By that time, the feedback is long gone. It's immediate here. Of course, there's a scoring by peers, calibrated by that peers calibration that will be part of the grade. But in order to give them an incentive to do a good job on the calibration and on the evaluation of themselves and the peers, the calibration score, the quality of the self-assessment, and the quality of the peer assessment is also brought in there. So if, let's say, they get a high score, but they are lousy at evaluating others, their score might go down a little bit. Completely automated, and it provides students an opportunity to reflect on their work and to see their work in the context of the others. Also to have a much more meaningful evaluation, even in a large class where no instructor could possibly do this enormous amount of work. So I'd like to end here, because my time is up, with a call to action, and then to acknowledge someone. First, a call to action. I hope I've convinced you that we really need to rethink our assessment, because I think unless we do so, we will continue to educate the followers of yesterday rather than the leaders of tomorrow. And just as importantly, I think our test will continue to fail to indicate how our students will succeed later in the workplace. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the important role that the person who we are honoring here today has played in my life, Dudley, who, in a sense, opened my eyes. Dudley is not only a scientist of indisputable accomplishment, but I think also someone who has influenced a great many people as an engaging and inspiring teacher. I don't know if you remember Dudley, but one day when I was still a junior faculty here at Harvard, we crossed paths in the Science Center, not very far from here. I was on my way to class, and you had just taught yours. And you told me about a little experiment you had done. You're shaking yes, you remember. You correct me if I recounted incorrectly. You had written down, I forgot what the topic was, but you had explained something and written it down on the board. And then for a few minutes, you talked about something else. And you went back to what you had just explained, and you asked your class a question about it. The answer was behind you on the board. No one could answer the question. And you connected that to a class on Shakespeare you had audited, I think here at Harvard. And each class dealt with another play of Shakespeare, and you had read most of them. The teacher asked the students to read the play before coming to class so that he or she didn't have to read the play to the students. Logical thing to do. In the sciences, we don't do that, actually. But then there was this one class where you had not read the play. King Lear, I forgot, was King? Oh, Twelfth Night, okay, Twelfth Night. And you noticed that not having read made it impossible to follow the class. And your conclusion was that what might be crystal clear to the expert is unlikely to make sense to somebody who is still learning and doesn't have the context to understand, which is a position many of our students actually are in. That discussion had a profound influence on my own perception of the role of the lecture. But I must be a bad student, for here I am some 25 years later, ironically, lecturing in front of you. I hope you all took notes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That was inspiring. I'm sure, so let's have a lively discussion. There are two microphones, and please step up to the microphone with your questions. Go ahead, yes.
Right. And thank you. Thank you for your exciting talk. The kind of liberal approach to education that you advocated to perhaps applies to the high end, the elite end of education, but there's a large load at the low end. Namely, there's a large number of poor public schools that are near bankruptcy. That relates to a lot of social problems, principally poverty and dysfunctional family. Do you think your kind of approach applies to that low end of education? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I don't teach in that environment, so I'm not really speaking about an area here that I'm expert about. But I read, in preparation for this lecture, quite a few papers on assessment, including a number of papers, which I highly recommend, written by, I think it's William Black, I'm not sure. The title of the paper is Inside the Black Box, a British educator, who actually talks about precisely the type of experiments that you mentioned, and it shows that by changing the assessment so it focuses on skills, not content, and so it focuses on feedback, not grades, not only lifts the overall distribution, even for children who have learning deficits, it not only lifts the entire distribution, but it especially lifts the bottom end, with, as a result, narrowing the entire distribution. So there is plenty of evidence, I think, to give an affirmative answer to your question.
Hello, I'm Bill English. I'm a research fellow with Harvard's Initiative on Learning and Teaching. And something that struck me, you had a slide about midway where you noted that it's precisely the things at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy that are most easy to objectively grade. And the kind of converse suggestion is that the most creative assignments might also be the ones that require the most judgment and expert assessment. And when we think about the excitement about online education, online learning, obviously it's very important for scale to be able to machine grade things and have that done computationally. Are you optimistic about the possibilities of using, say, calibrated peer assessment and other maybe intelligence, automated intelligence systems to automate in machine ways more complex creative assignments? Or do you think there are certain sorts of education and learning that really will always have to be in a small seminar classroom environment?
I think this is a great question, and I think the current practices I'm not very hopeful about because they're really at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy. However, calibrated peer review is something that you could definitely scale up and put online. So I think there are definitely approaches that could be used. They are not yet used, but they could be used to improve the quality of online assessment tremendously. Yes. And there are other ideas too, but I'll talk to you about that one-on-one. Yeah.
Yeah, just a footnote, edX has a peer review, instructor review utility that does a lot of those things if you want to do it. But my question is actually a little bit upstream even of assessment, and you touched on it, but what do you really want to assess? What is it that we want the students to go out of their being able to do? I mean, sure, they have lots of excitement in learning it, but what is it that we want to assess? And how do we decide that, especially in the context where we're teaching a course that's in the catalog and there's some enforcement of covering those topics?
Well, thank you, David, for that question. I think that's, that is crucial. What do we want our students to be able to do? If you look at the sort of standard assessment and you ask yourself, what are the skills that are being tested here, the picture that emerges is not very different from the little example I gave with the parking lot problem, right? So I think that any conversation about assessment needs to be preceded by a conversation about learning outcomes. And those learning outcomes are at many different levels. There are the learning outcomes for a specific course. There are learning outcomes for a specific major. There are the learning outcomes for a college degree as a whole. So you can start from the bottom up and only define the learning goals for your course. But I think in an ideal world, we all, educators, would have a discussion and agree on a set of learning outcomes that we want our students, for you at MIT, for us at Harvard, to attain by the end of their college education. And then we can start thinking about what does it mean to have a physics degree or a chemistry degree or an English degree. What are the type of learning outcomes for such a degree? And finally, we could start dividing the curriculum and get to a much more fine-grained set of skills that we want to develop in the individual courses. I think that would make for a much healthier approach to teaching. I see Rick Miller here in the audience. I mean, Olin College has certainly done an admirable job of defining the competencies for the college as a whole, and to have the learning outcomes for both the majors and the courses satisfy those overall competencies. I'm sorry I cannot be more specific because you need to, I mean, I'm happy to share the learning outcomes from my course with you, but it's a long list because there are quite a few competencies that I want my students to achieve. But I think it's a crucial point.
Many of our students go on to professional schools and graduate schools, and there the assessments are, if you will, bottom feeding at the very base of that pyramid. Is there any opportunity, is there any way of leveraging this new approach to assessment to the national level so that the MCAT is no longer regurgitation of facts learned, usually outside of classroom because Harvard doesn't teach to that test, and likewise for the many other assessments that are used by our students as they get to the next step in their professional development?
Very good point. I've heard that the MCAT has significantly improved, that they're moving away from regurgitation to much more questions that test process rather than answer. But it's a difficult, I mean, because education has so many different moving parts, it's really difficult to change. At one point, I realized that many of my incoming students had a 5 on the AP C, and if I do a correlation between AP scores, I almost showed this plot today, but I ran out of time. But if you do a correlation between AP scores and how students do on this conceptual survey at the beginning of the class, there's hardly any correlation. So clearly what the AP test is not something that I really want students to accomplish. So basically in the late 90s, early 2000s, I thought the best way is for me to be on the committee that designs the AP exams and then try to change the exam. So for 5 years, I served on the AP Development Committee. for AP Physics B and C. Imagine a supertanker. It's already hard to maneuver. Now you remove the rudder. It's only one way it can go, straight. See, I would come to, so every 3 times a year, there are 3 college faculty and 3 high school faculty who meet together with some ETS people to discuss the next exam, 2 years ahead, actually. And each time, each of the committee members is supposed to bring in a stash of problems. So I would bring in my conceptual problems from Harvard. First of all, long discussions. Most people didn't like them because, you know, they were not just an equation. And what happens then is that the questions that were finally accepted by the committee and the ETS people are field tested, which means they send them out. You may have received as college faculty a letter from the ETS asking you to test questions. This is the AP test a few years ahead, and they want to collect some statistics to see how it goes. I come back to the next meeting, and these statisticians would come, psychometricians or whatever they're called, and they tell me, Professor Mazur, your questions are not good. I'd say, what do you mean they're not good? I use them at Harvard. And he said, well, our good students don't do well on them. What they do, what they've done for the past 30 years is they've used what they call correlators. These are problems that they've had for 30 years, and they've cross-correlated them with performance on AP exams. If a problem does not correlate with the correlator, which is, you know, exactly like the parking lot problem, it's not a good problem, because the holy cow there, in a sense, is reliability and reproducibility. It's better to measure something that is worthless, as long as I'm exaggerating a little bit here, as long as it's reproducible, rather than measure something meaningful and it not being reproducible. So it's really, really difficult to induce change.
Eric, I just wanted to turn the assessment on its head. I can't resist pointing out that your daughter Natalie took 2 courses with me. I hope everyone can be sympathetic to the pressure that was on Eric's daughter.
I'll text her right now.
Neither of which required memorizing the side chains of amino acids, for example.
She has great respect for you, Rich.
I just had a thought about applying for jobs in businesses and whatnot, and how a lot of those interview questions are more like your questions, where they sort of just give you this open problem without, assume X factor. They make you figure out the assumptions and then mold a model in that way. And I was wondering if businesses might pair up with, or if they already do, with education and assessment, and sort of, I don't know, create some network that might encourage teachers to move towards these real world problems.
I think that's a very good suggestion. Certainly nobody from the business world has approached me, at least not for that reason. But I think it would be an excellent... is there somebody else in the audience who's willing to comment on that, who has a different experience from my own? Yeah, Dudley.
Well, this reminds me of Enrico Fermi.
Oh, yeah, yes.
He liked to ask questions, how many piano tuners are there in Chicago? You had to make some assumptions. It's 72.
Incidentally, in my course, I've built in assessment. One of the activities in the class is to make students comfortable with, sorry, not assessment, estimation, sorry. So I have estimation activities every week or other week where students have to estimate quantities without knowing anything, very much like the parking lot problem. And the first time they're uncomfortable, the second time they're more comfortable. By the end of the course, they're able to do exactly, the person who asked the question is gone, there in the back. They're able to do exactly what you were referring to and make estimation problems in job interviews.
One more, and then after which we'll make it more informal, and if you have additional questions, I'm sure Eric would entertain them up front. So, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Mazur. I also had a question on what role assumptions play in answering a question.
What?
What role the making of assumptions play in answering a question. But one of the things that I think about a lot is how the individual backgrounds of students really skew the types of assumptions they make and sort of the intellectual leeway they give themselves in doing it. I guess to give an example, I took a biology course here that asked an interesting question whose full details I don't remember at the moment, but there was a chemistry class I'd also taken here, and if you used certain pieces of information from the chemistry class to approach this question, it actually made it complicated in a lot of ways that were sort of inhomogeneously occurring throughout the class, because it sort of became, if you had been exposed to sort of these details, you realize there might have been more to it than the other people did. So especially in a uniform grading system, how do you go about, well, accounting for it?
I think that's a very good question, and I'm happy you're asking that. You see, if I were to use just one such question, then my ability to reliably judge a person would be very limited, and it would be affected by many factors that I do not control. People's background knowledge and so on, the data that I'm testing on, you name it. But as you know from AP 50, if you do lots of them, a picture will emerge. On some questions, some people are maybe somewhat disadvantaged because they didn't know this or that, but on others, they might not be the disadvantaged one, but those who have an advantage because they know something else. So as long as you do not, and this is perhaps something interesting to discuss in general too, I found out that if you measure along only one dimension, let's say textbook problems, a reliable picture emerges. It might not be very meaningful, but a reliable picture emerges. If you measure among many dimensions, the grade distribution actually collapses because you find that students who do well in one dimension might not do that well on another, and vice versa. So I think for that reason, it's important that we use a lot of input to determine the eventual evaluation of our students. And also, maybe we should do away with grades completely and focus on the, given that grades are such a poor indicator of success anyway, maybe we should do away with grades and focus mainly on the feedback, like at this Nueva school in California. And there are several studies in the article Inside the Black Box by Black. He refers to a study that was done in England where they're taking a school, taking away the grading completely, and found, and focused on feedback, and found that the students worked harder and focused on the learning rather than on earning points. So I think you raised a lot of important points, and I hope that we can continue this discussion because it's an important one.
Thank you.
Thank you.